Well, welcome everybody here today, and also to not only the people here, but also to the numbers of people online. And it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jim Powell, who has had a varied career, as well as being an historian. He's a successful novelist, at least three, maybe even more, but at least three well-received novels, and was previously before that worked in advertising and also in pottery, I gather, as well. So he has a variety of things that he's been doing, and as after that, those careers turned to history and did a PhD under a friend of the institute, Professor Richard Hussey, and is publishing a book with Liverpool University Press. It's published, or
yes, it is
published. Yes, it's published with the Liverpool University Press, which will form the basis of what he's going to be talking about today. So it's a great pleasure for the Wilberforce Institute to invite you, Jim Powell, who's going to be talking to us tonight on Losing the Thread, Cotton, Liverpool, and the American Civil War. Jim.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Now, when I graduated in 1971, if you can believe, I thought that would be the end of my academic career. And for more than 40 years, it was. And then in 2014, my interest, in fact, piqued by my great-great-grandfather's adventures in the cotton trade. I decided to attempt a PhD at Liverpool University, and the subject was the effect of the American Civil War on the British raw cotton trade. A book resulted from that thesis, and here it is. Brilliant. There's a hard copy anyway. That was a book that resulted, which for once I'm not going to particularly encourage you to buy because it costs 90 quid. So if you can find a library, maybe your library should have it. But anyway, the library has it. Next year it will be out in softback, so hopefully it will be a little more reasonable at that point. Anyway, one of the most enjoyable consequences of doing it is being able to come to events like this and to meet and talk to people who, in different ways, are also interested in the broad subject of slavery. So I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to thank Judith Spixley for organising it, for inviting me, and all of you for attending it. Now, I've given this talk a deliberately contentious title, which is Why Britain Did Not Abolish Slavery Until 1865. And I will now try and justify that. When I learned history at school, which is, you can imagine, was a long time ago now, I had to memorise, as did we all then, key dates in British history. One that sticks in the mind was 1807 abolition of slavery. To that date was attached the name of Wilberforce. Well, of course, Britain did not abolish slavery in 1807. However, there are grounds for arguing that slavery was not abolished in 1834 either. It may then have become illegal in most of Britain's colonies. But the fact is that what was by far Britain's largest industry, the cotton industry, continued to be almost entirely dependent on American slave labour right up until the American Civil War of 1861 to 65. It was only after that war and the American abolition of slavery that Britain became largely freed from its own dependence on human bondage. My book is not primarily about slavery. Rather, it examines the effects of the American Civil War on the British cotton trade, especially in Liverpool. But a book about cotton at that time is necessarily also a book about slavery. Slavery and cotton were so inextricably linked that this could not fail to be the case. The historian Brian Shern has written, quote, "Without cotton and the international demand for it, there would not have been secession or a civil war." And I think that is absolutely true. My talk today is about the links between cotton, slavery, and the Civil War. I will start by describing the state of Britain's cotton trade when the Civil War started in 1861. After that, I'll describe the cotton economy in the southern states of America at the outbreak of war, followed by an examination of the causes of the Civil War. And then I will look at attitudes within Britain at that time, and especially amongst the cotton trade, and to its reliance on slave-grown cotton. And finally, I will consider what happened to the cotton economy in the southern states of America after the Civil War. At no time since the Industrial Revolution has one industry dominated the British economy, British employment, and British exports in the way that cotton did for most of the 19th century. In 1850, Britain possessed 60% of the world's spindles and 53% of its power looms. In 1853, it supplied 45% of the world's consumption of cotton cloth. By 1860, cotton accounted for 11.5% of national income. And at that time, nearly half the factories in this country were for cotton production. Raw cotton accounted for 18% of British imports and cotton goods for 38% of British exports. In 1861, the number of people directly employed in the industry was about 646,000. Those not directly employed but still dependent on cotton for their livelihoods took that figure into the millions. About 1/6 of the population of England, Scotland, and Wales was, to a greater or lesser extent, reliant on cotton for its income, including most people within the borders of Lancashire and Cheshire. But Britain grew no cotton. As the historian Sven Beckert has pointed out, British cotton manufacturing was the first major industry in human history that lacked locally produced raw materials. In 1860, British factories processed nearly £1.5 billion weight of raw cotton, and every single bale of it needed to be imported. In the 3 years before the war, the American share of those imports averaged 80%. In other words, Britain's largest industry by far was almost entirely reliant on slave-grown American cotton. The cotton trade was well aware of the danger of over-dependence on a single source of supply and on one that was based on slave labour. Henry Ashworth, who was a major mill owner and later president of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, wrote that never before has so large and perilous a dependence been found to rest upon so small a portion of the human race, or upon a people so lightly esteemed as the Negroes usually are. The scale of the problem is shown by the fact that in 1860, America grew 66% of the world's cotton and more than 75% of all cotton entering world trade. It produced it at a landed price in Liverpool that other countries could not undercut, and which gave them no incentive to expand their own cotton cultivation. The dominance of American cotton meant that it set the price for the world market. According to one Liverpool cotton broker, slavery was an institution which had served as much to foster the production of cotton in the States as in most other countries it had served to discourage it. And then, in August 1861, the raw cotton stopped coming. That is the most extraordinarily dramatic graph it just shows you, in August 1861, this large trade collapsed to zero. 80% of Britain's raw cotton stopped coming in that month. The Civil War had started in April. Now 80% of the supply was switched off. Cotton feast turned to cotton famine. And from then until April 1865, 4 years later, when the war ended, this country was starved of most of the raw material for its largest industry. The market, British cotton market, as it had existed before 1861 and would exist again later, ceased to function for those 4 years. So that is the British context for the cotton trade at the start of the American Civil War. Let's now look at the American context. In the 40 years before the Civil War, British imports of American cotton grew tenfold. Since almost all that cotton was grown by slaves, there was also a tenfold increase in the number of slaves who produced the cotton. It is not an exaggeration to say that Britain's insatiable demand for raw cotton was single-handedly responsible for the expansion of slavery in America in the first 6 decades of the 19th century. Sven Beckett has argued that the growth of the British cotton manufacture was inextricably linked to American slavery, and it is impossible to dispute that view. By the 1820s, American slavery had become synonymous with cotton, expanding only to regions in which cotton could be grown. By 1850, about 70% of the American slave population was involved in growing cotton. This huge growth in the demand for cotton, and thus in the demand for slaves, prompted a rise in the value of slaves. The price of a prime field hand had risen from $600 in 1802 to $1,800 in 1860, and that at a time when there was negligible inflation. That was equivalent in 1860 to a British farm labourer's wages for 15 years. And by the time the costs of food, clothing and housing, however primitive, were added, it was arguable that slave labour had become nearly as expensive as wage labour, and it was certainly more capital intensive. Much of the capital of individual planters and of the southern states in general was tied up in slaves. The significance of this fact should not be underestimated. Slaves were the largest single asset that wealthy southerners possessed. It is a thoroughly unpleasant way to look at it, but the fact is that the price of slaves was as important to slaveholders as house prices are to homeowners today. You consider the case of the state of Mississippi. Before the Civil War, about half its population was enslaved. The value of those slaves was so great that despite the fact that Mississippi had few other capital assets, it was America's 5th richest state, at least on paper. After the war, after abolition, at a stroke, it became the poorest state in the Union. An analogy might be to consider what would happen to Britain today if the City of London suddenly disappeared overnight. Right? The economies of the southern states were wholly dependent on slavery, and therefore on slaves being a valuable asset. There were two main threats to the maintenance of slave values. The first, which was demanded by the more radical secessionists in the southern states, would have been reopening the African slave trade, which, as you know, the US had ended, at least theoretically, in 1808. However, most slaveholders perceived that the consequence of this would be to depress the price of slaves by increasing their availability. So the Confederacy's Montgomery Constitution of 1861 specifically banned the African slave trade and even authorized the Confederate Congress to stop the importation of slaves from the northern states, which was happening at that time. The second threat came from the constant drip of northern hostility to slavery. The market for slaves, like any other, was subject to investor sentiment and confidence. Even if slaveholders believed that Lincoln lacked the power, the public support, and the will to end slavery, they feared that his administration would reduce confidence in its long-term future, thereby causing a fall in the market. In October 1860, a month before Lincoln's election, the Charleston Mercury predicted that if he was elected, that would cause an immediate drop of $100 in the value of the slave. That would have equated to a depreciation of $400 million, or about $12 billion today, in the capital wealth of the South. And the economic historian Gavin Rice has argued that it was these fears that were the catalyst for secession, rather than any belief in the imminence of emancipation. It remains a moot point whether Britain's increasing demand for raw cotton could have been supplied without slavery. America would eventually, later in the century, grow more cotton with free labour than it had with slave labour. And even in the pre-war period, the free labour that produced Indian cotton was cheaper than slave labour in America. It is also undeniable that America came to be the predominant producer of cotton for reasons other than slavery. Product quality, vastly superior transportation, the almost unlimited availability of new land, and perhaps most of all, the fact that cotton was grown as a commercial and not a subsistence crop. However, it remains highly unlikely that at the precise moment when Britain required a rapidly expanding volume of raw cotton, that cotton could have been supplied from anywhere other than America or on any basis other than slave labour. As one contemporary commentator put it, the intimate connection between the growth of our cotton manufacture and the extension of slavery in the United States is not a very pleasant subject for contemplation. The threat posed to Britain by this connection had at least as much to do with the economic as with the political future of slavery. The number of slaves, and hence the size of America's cotton crop, was growing more slowly than the British demand for raw cotton. In 1856, the New York Herald concluded, viewing the question of labour available for increasing the crop of cotton to meet the increase of consumption in 10 years, in no point of view can we arrive at the conclusion that adequate labour for its production can be found. The British cotton trade thus found itself in the position of wanting no slaves in America in theory, while requiring a great many more of them in practice. The Liberal MP Thomas Bazley told a meeting of the Cotton Supply Association that whilst we wait for an increase in the number of Negroes, we have to wait in the same proportion for an increase in the supply of cotton. So this, in broad terms, was the American context for the cotton trade at the start of the Civil War. Why was that war fought? Okay. When I started my PhD, I was warned by Richard Hussey, my supervisor, not to make any comment on the causes of the American Civil War. It was irrelevant to my thesis, he said, and remained so controversial a topic that any view I expressed might alienate an examiner. So I kept quiet. But here we are today in a private-ish gathering, and you're not examining me. So here goes. The main reason, in my view, that the causes of the Civil War remain such a contentious subject is that in America, the Civil War has not yet ended. The issues that it raised are still unresolved today. Evidence of this is provided by the Trump presidency, storming of the Capitol, and numerous atrocities committed over the past 150 years and still committed today. A large number of white Americans, mainly but not entirely in the southern states, are still sympathetic to the Confederacy today. But because few of them, and especially the historians amongst them, are willing to stand up and defend slavery in public, they need to argue instead that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, and that the South fought it for other reasons. And they're much helped in this by the fact that in the early years of the war, President Lincoln's government said exactly the same thing. It is true that the South did have other grievances with the North. There was resentment that about 40% of its cotton income ended up in the hands of northern banks and merchants. This situation resulted largely from wealthy Southerners choosing to invest most of their capital in purchasing more slaves, rather than in developing the commercial infrastructure of their states. Planters mortgaged their cotton crops several years ahead and used the finance to buy more slaves. According to one contemporary writer, not 1 in 15 planters is free of debt. As a result, in 1860, 90% of America's industrial output was in the northern states, as well as 85% of the chartered banks. To return to the question of what started the Civil War, this is in reality two questions. The war would not have happened if the southern states had not seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. So the first question is, why did the southern states secede? The second, and I think separate question, is why was secession followed by civil war? There should be no doubt that the southern states seceded in order to protect the future of slavery. They may have had other grievances with the North, but none strong enough to compel secession. And this is, I think, abundantly clear from the public utterances of numerous southern politicians at the time. Congressman Alfred Iverson of Georgia proclaimed that it is the intention of the Black Republican Party, that's what they called it, to use the forms of government to extinguish the system of slavery, and we do not intend to wait until we are so weak that we cannot resist. As the British politician and economist Richard Cobden said in 1863, the slave states were invited by the free states in January 1861 to say what it was they wanted, and from the beginning to the end of those 40 pages of the report of that council, there was not a grievance that was alleged by the South which was not altogether connected with the maintenance of slavery. That should answer the first question, and since the Civil War could not have happened without secession, it goes some way to answering the second question. But not the whole way. Lincoln's government could have accepted secession as a fait accompli, as many people both here and in America thought that it would, and indeed should. The fact that it didn't, though, was not because of the North's opposition to slavery. Most people in the North were largely indifferent to slavery. Instead, it was, as Lincoln always claimed, to preserve the integrity of the Union. America was obviously at that point a new country, relatively. It had existed for less than a century. It had expanded rapidly. There had been 13 founding states in the Union, and by 1861 there were 34, plus several others that would later become states, but which were still territories. Several New England states had already threatened to secede before the Civil War. There was talk of secession in California, all of which is forgotten these days because of the big secession that did happen. But there was talk of secession in many parts of the states. So to the federal government, it must have appeared that the country was in danger of falling apart, and this made it imperative that it should not be allowed to do so. So that generates my answer to those two questions. Now, the emotions and perceived grievances that created the clamour for secession needed a plausible strategy for it to be successful, and Cotton was absolutely the key to this. The phrase, "Cotton is king," was first used in the title of an 1855 book by David Christie. Thereafter, the unchallengeable power of King Cotton was proclaimed throughout the South. The belief that a lack of cotton would force Britain and France to intervene in any civil war on its behalf, despite slavery, was an inviolable principle for Southern policy making. After the war, the widow of Jefferson Davis, who had been the president of the Confederacy, wrote that her husband had regarded foreign recognition as an assumed fact. "Why, sir," said a fellow diner to William Howard Russell of the Times at Charleston in April 1861, "we have only to shut off your supply of cotton for a few weeks and we can create a revolution in Great Britain. No, sir, we know that England must recognise us." In June 1861, the Charleston Mercury declared that the cards are in our hands and we intend to play them out to the bankruptcy of every cotton factory in Great Britain and France, or the acknowledgement of our independence. And many Northerners shared the opinion that Britain would intervene. The historian Scott Marler has referred to the King Cotton strategy as a sort of faith-based foreign policy. However, the faith did have a grounding in reality, because the conviction of the South in the political potency of its cotton was matched by a parallel conviction in Britain. Henry Ashworth told a meeting in 1858 that the entire failure of a cotton crop, should it ever occur, would utterly destroy, and perhaps forever, all the manufacturing prosperity we possess. This is a completely ludicrous statement by an extremely successful and well-informed man, who's what he said. But what Southerners failed to notice was that hysterical pronouncements of this nature invariably came from British cotton manufacturers and from the politicians connected to them, who were just as one-eyed about cotton as the Southerners were themselves. In 1861, W.H. Russell observed that Liverpool and Manchester have obscured all the rest of Great Britain to the southern eye. As a result, the South miscalculated. In J. Sexton's words, the singular economy of the Confederacy collapsed under the weight of its unexported cotton, whereas Britain's more diverse economy was able to cope with the consequences. It coped only with great difficulty, though, and those difficulties form the main substance of my book. For the 4 years of the war, despite increased imports from other countries, Britain received only about 40% of the cotton that its mills needed. That's a solid line. Oh, sorry, solid line of cotton. Yeah. And because of the scarcity, the price of cotton, is the top line, more than quadrupled. And this resulted in a bonanza for the cotton brokers of Liverpool, who had the most profitable years in their entire history, and that's saying something. And that is described in detail in the book. But the consequence beyond Liverpool was what has become known as the Lancashire cotton famine. Trough of the famine was in the winter of 1862 to 63, when the numbers out of work, more than 247,000, the numbers claiming relief at more than 485,000, both peaked in December 1862, and at that point, a quarter of Lancashire's inhabitants were receiving public assistance at a time when there was very little public assistance. I'm not going to talk further about all of that today, because it's slightly off topic for you. But I would like to talk about this. My impression is that by the 1860s, almost the whole of Britain was vehemently opposed to slavery, and indeed enthralled to Harriet Beecher Stowe's account of it in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even those Britons who became propagandists for the Confederacy, and there weren't many, but there were some, mostly disclaimed any support for slavery. Yet, the British economy, as we've just seen, relied to a vast extent on the continuation of slavery in America. The mill owners and others engaged in Britain's cotton industry were no exceptions to general public opinion in Britain. Most of them supported the Liberal Party. Many of them were strongly anti-imperialist. Most mill owners were convinced abolitionists, yet they had earned a collective fortune on the back of slave labour in America. How did they justify it? Well, Britain and its cotton trade might have been opposed to slavery in principle, but by 1860 the majority view was that what a British government could not control should not affect British behaviour. The consequence was that the trade turned a collective blind eye to how its cotton was produced. In Eugene Dapple's words, most New Yorkers did not care that the cotton was produced by slaves because for them it became sanitized once it left the plantation. And for New Yorkers, one could equally well read Mancunians or the British in general. The British cotton trade, while professing itself outraged by slavery, was more than content to profit from it. Some people advocated a boycott of cotton produced by slaves, but only once an alternative source of supply had been established. This sentiment carried more than the whiff of St. Augustine's prayer, "Please God, make me good, but not just yet." There was a cognitive dissonance amongst the cotton manufacturers and merchants. During his tour of the US in 1860, Henry Ashworth, who was, by the way, a Quaker, was under pressure to explain his own moral stance and that of his fellow mill owners. He was told, quote, "If the raising of cotton and sugar by slave labour does constitute a theft, as the English abolitionists have insisted, surely the receiving of goods so stolen, whether by purchase or otherwise, must constitute a participation in the crime. And in this case, the British people themselves were the greatest of moralists and the greatest of sinners. We may have had the worst of it in the discussion, yet we do not hesitate to give the substance of the remarks." Thus, Ashworth admits to having had the worst of the argument. He takes pride in his honesty in repeating the criticism, but he seems to feel under no obligation whatsoever to provide any sort of answer. The degree of both hypocrisy and moral disconnection seems extraordinary. Yet it was commonplace within both the British cotton trade and British society at the time. Slavery was evil, but eliminating it in America was someone else's problem to be achieved at some undefined future point. It is not surprising that John Watts, historian of the cotton famine, should remark that it may safely be affirmed that if the annihilation of slavery had depended upon the people of this Christian land paying knowingly 1 farthing per yard extra for free labour cotton, slavery would have gone on forever. While there is no evidence that the British cotton trade positively fostered slavery as the most economical means of producing cotton, there is abundant evidence of an indifference as to how its cotton was produced, cocooned in a wrapper of self-serving moral humbug. The trade was not so much immoral as amoral. It did not really mind where its cotton came from, as long as it came and as long as it was cheap. When it failed to come, the cotton trade did not look specifically for non-slave trade cotton, it looked for any cotton. Henry Ashworth declared that spinners would buy cotton anywhere and asked no questions as to whether it was slave grown or not. Then there was the question for the manufacturers as to what would happen to their business if slavery was abolished in America. And what had happened to West Indian sugar after the British abolition of slavery offered a disturbing precedent. Former slaves were unwilling to return to the sugar plantations as freedmen, There was a shortage of labour. Slave growing sugar from Brazil and Cuba became cheaper than West India. No one could know whether in America there would be continued availability of cotton without slaves. In the early stages of the war, almost the sole concern of the cotton trade was when it would end. But as the war progressed, and as the likelihood receded that slavery would survive it intact or at all, and as the devastation caused by the war to the agricultural economy of the South was appreciated, it became clear that the close of the war would be the start of a process, not the end of one, and that its eventual outcome was as uncertain as the outcome of the war would be. No one knew whether or when large and regular supplies of American cotton might resume. No one knew whether cotton produced by free labour would be as cheap as cotton produced by slaves, or even whether sufficient free labour would be found in America to plant and to harvest it. No one knew at what price American cotton would become available once the Southern economy had stabilised. No one knew what quantity of cotton might regularly be required from other countries to replace an American shortfall. No one knew whether the vast mill capacity in Lancashire, which had continued to grow despite the war, would now be filled or could be made profitable. It is easy to see, therefore, that whatever beliefs the cotton trade may have had in principle, they had substantial practical reasons to fear the ending of slavery. And as perhaps usually happens when an abstract principle and substantial self-interest collide, self-interest came out on top. Some people in Britain did refuse to buy goods made from slave-grown cotton, but there were not many of them. What would have happened if the whole country had boycotted slave-grown cotton? It is a futile question because that was never going to happen. But if it had, and even if other countries had continued to buy American cotton, it must be doubtful whether the southern states would have had the economic strength or the confidence to secede from the Union, and therefore doubtful whether the Civil War would have occurred. In the end, it took the deaths of well over 500,000 Americans, both North and South, to break the British economic reliance on slavery. It is nevertheless ironic that this reliance accelerated at precisely the time that Britain ended first the slave trade and then slavery itself. Before considering what can be learned from this tale, it is worth saying something about what happened to American cotton after abolition, after the end of the war. In the immediate aftermath of the Union victory, many freedmen simply stopped working. My great-great-grandfather, William Neal, toured the southern states in late 1865 to assess what had happened to the cotton crop and what was likely to happen to it. And he wrote home, to read it, John Williams, he wrote, the Negroes seem to be nearly all leaving the plantations and wandering about. William himself came from a strongly abolitionist family who had hosted Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison on their British speaking tours. But that's what he found. Many of the freedmen migrated to the towns. One way of looking at the post-war situation is to envisage a vast commercial enterprise on which the entire southern economy depended, and from which the whole workforce had conceptually vanished. There was an imperative for the freedmen remaining in the countryside to work and to acquire the means of subsistence. Their only option was to grow cotton. This inevitably raised the question of land tenure and ownership. Many freedmen hoped and expected that the federal government would give them land after emancipation. But widespread amnesties for former Confederates and the consequent restoration of their estates were paid to these nations. Without redistribution of land, few freedmen could afford to buy land, few white landowners would sell to them, And those who did so were often subjected to physical violence, so land remained almost entirely a white preserve. Without land, it was impossible for the freedmen to achieve full independence. However, they did retain one weapon in their fight to escape a resurrection in the form of plantation system, their labour. As long as the freedmen were prepared to hold out against the progression from slavery to wage slavery, the planters needed to make concessions if any cotton was to be grown. Increasingly, the freedmen refused paid employment. Different forms of land tenure on the plantations developed as a consequence of the standoff, and in particular sharecropping, whereby the cropper was paid for his labour via a share of the proceeds of his own crop at the end of the harvest year. By the late 1870s, insofar as it can be established, about 5% of the freedmen owned their own land, 20% rented, 20% worked as employed labour, and 55% were sharecroppers. By the end of the century, it was estimated that in 6 key cotton-growing states, more than 75% of African American farmers were sharecroppers. Cotton prices tumbled throughout the 1870s and continued to fall for most of the rest of the century. This necessitated permanent recourse to the credit merchants, permanent liens on the crop, and permanent debt. Increasingly, the same crop had charges upon it for rental labour and for supplies advanced, sometimes by more than one provider. When the crop was good and prices high, all claims could be satisfied. When they were not, which was progressively the case from the 1870s onwards, they could not. So the freedmen were forced back into dependence, at least until the next crop was harvested. Servitude for life was commuted to servitude for a year. Unless a better alternative could be found at the end of that year, it would become servitude for another year. In many instances, slavery became peerage, debt servitude. This was the reality of post-emancipation life for most freedmen. The logical solution would have been for the farmers, both African American and white, to have planted less cotton and produced more food. But the credit merchants would not allow it because it would have undermined most of their sources of income. The terms of their loans imposed increased cotton production on the farmers, despite the tumbling prices and despite the fact that it was a barely profitable activity. A region that had once been self-sufficient could no longer feed itself. The simplest way of viewing the southern cotton economy in the decades after the Civil War is as a vast system of payday loans, with the difference that the payday came only once a year and was usually insufficient to pay the loan. The perennial question for British cotton manufacturers before and during the Civil War had been whether cotton grown by free labour could be produced as efficiently as cotton grown by slaves. It had been supposed, not unreasonably, that the answer to this question would determine the price of raw cotton after the war. But it did not. This issue was made a theoretical abstraction by the excessive volume of cotton grown, which had a far greater impact on its price than the cost of production. The peak period of growth for cotton manufacturers was now over, yet America was increasing its supply of raw cotton faster than the worldwide market was consuming it. The cotton would still be sold, but only at prices that were so low that they barely covered the cost of production, if that. The dollar return of each acre under cotton cultivation reduced by 75% between 1869 and 1896. Collectively, the South had a near monopoly of the supply of raw cotton to the world market. But collectively, the South had no need. It existed only as an assortment of desperately poor individuals, both African Americans and whites, with no means of using their combined power to raise prices. On a macro level, the decision to grow less cotton was imperative. On an individual level, it was impossible. This was not so much a failure of free labour as a catastrophic failure of the free market. None of this seems to have concerned the British cotton trade unduly. There were frequent and lengthy press commentaries on American cotton cultivation immediately after the war, while the future remained uncertain. But once cotton started to flow again from America, cheaply and in quantity, comments became fewer. All the British cotton trader ever cared about was obtaining a large volume of raw cotton at a low price. How this was achieved had been a matter of indifference under slavery, and it remained a matter of indifference after slavery. So, conclusions. If history has any use apart from trying to establish as best one can the facts of what actually happened, it would surely be to draw lessons about human nature and human behaviour in the hope that they might illuminate the future. I do believe that almost all of us have a better nature, and I believe that we all, given the chance to behave decently on small personal issues, usually do so. But to that extent, I remain an optimist and an idealist. But on issues that involve a conflict between this better nature and self-interest, I'm rather more cynical. For all of us, whether individuals or companies or governments, once one has got into a situation one shouldn't be in, it can be extremely hard to get out of it. In both the southern states of America and in the cotton trade of Great Britain, a dependence on slavery had grown up over time for a whole variety of economic and practical reasons, and within the context of an evil morality. But once it had grown up, and despite the fact that the moral context had changed, the dependence proved impossible to break until it was broken by war. And if we would like to think that such things would never happen today, perhaps we're wrong. Consider the textile industry. Many of us wear clothes produced under working conditions that are in principle nothing to us, including the widespread use of child labour. Yet most of us turn the same blind eye to this as our forebears turned to wearing cotton clothes made from slave-grown cotton. We thus tacitly enabled atrocious working conditions in Asian countries, as once we tacitly enabled the continuation of slavery in America. It might be thought that in this context at least, moral progress since has been negligible. It may be that in 150 years' time, future students at the Wilberforce Institute will be contemplating how and why we behave in such a way. To conclude, the shots fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on the 12th of April 1861, and which started the American Civil War, heralded the end of an era. Rather than protecting the future of slavery as the Confederacy intended, the shots hastened its demise. They marked the eclipse of an age when Britain, despite being in denial of the fact, had used American slaves to dominate the world market for cotton goods. The termination of slave-bearing cotton in America was a significant milestone in Britain's tortuous process of disengaging from its economic dependence on human bondage, and it heralded a freer, more diverse global cotton community. But while the British cotton trade suffered heavy losses during the war that ended slavery, those losses were dwarfed by the profits which slavery had enabled before the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, for a fascinating historical talk and sort of some parallels to today as well. I think the next few weeks we'll probably see British people's test of how they, what they view of working conditions overseas and their love of football tested in all sorts of interesting sorts of ways. Do you have any questions for him? Well, can I start off then? Why is sugar different than cotton in to the history of Britain's attitude towards slavery?
Well, I suppose I'm a cotton historian. Most historians, I realise, can talk about a fairly broad period of time. Because of my background, I studied very specifically the cotton trade and at a particular time, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert. But my immediate answer to the question would be to say that sugar was grown, sugar that Britain consumed was grown in British colonies. And therefore, once this country had resolved that it was going to end slavery, then that dealt with that issue. Because cotton was not grown by British slaves, but by some other countries' slaves, it didn't have to confront that issue. So it had already been through the sugar, by the time we get to the Civil War, it had already been through the question of sugar and how to acquire it after slavery being abolished in the British Empire. But cotton was still continuing.
Could you tell us a little bit about the ships, British ships that were built to break the blockade of the southern Lincoln's blockade of the southern ports?
Yes.
And because they wanted to supply cotton.
They did. That's a question I can answer quite reasonably well, anyway. And it is one of the things that surprised me when I was researching this is there is so much romance in inverted commas about the activity of blockade running. So much prominence has been given to it. So many books have been written about it. The first thing that's important to say is that blockade running was an economically negligible activity. During the Civil War, it accounted for less than 0.5% of the Port of Liverpool's trade, and virtually all of it went through Liverpool. It was almost non-existent. What was important was not, in the scale of things, was not the cotton that was brought back to Britain, which was very little, but on the arms and ammunition that was sent to supply the Confederate armies. That had a far greater impact on events during the war than the cotton. The blockade running itself, and again, some historians are misleading when they write about it. It is not the case that ships went out from Liverpool or wherever to Charleston or Wilmington or wherever and carrying arms and bringing back cotton. Because early in the war, the Union sealed the ports in the Gulf of Mexico and it captured New Orleans, which were the only deep sea ports in the Confederacy. And Charleston and Wilmington were both had ports with shallow harbors where you could not take large ocean-going vessels. So the way that blockade trade worked is that what were called depot ships were sent out from Liverpool to usually Nassau in the Bahamas. And then in Nassau, there was a fleet of much smaller, much nimbler ships that would run into the southern ports and then back out again. Now, most of the ships in the first part of that trade, the depot ships, most of them were built in Britain, but not very few of them were built in Liverpool. Most were built on the Clyde, quite a lot in London, some in Liverpool, but that's where they came from. The ones that actually ran the blockade were mostly built in the Confederate States. They were mostly built actually in Charleston and were owned by John Fraser and Company in Charleston, a lot of them. So it was a sort of a cooperative trade between Britain and the Confederacy, but it was not, in terms of the cotton, it was not important.
So what was caused the American government to ask for reparations end of the war?
Okay, it asked, well, the reparations were not to do with blockade running. They were to do with the fact that Britain built a number of warships for the Confederacy, one of which, the most notorious of which, was the Alabama, was built by Laird Brothers in Birkenhead, and which for, I don't remember exactly how long, but it was eventually sunk for 2 or 3 years. It roamed the seas, sinking or capturing any Union vessels it found. And that was regarded by the federal government, and indeed it was also regarded that way by many people in Britain, I might say, as piracy. I mean, this is just going around sinking commercial shipping. So it was for that reason that reparations were claimed at the end of the war, and indeed, Britain paid millions of dollars in compensation to the American government for the damage done by the Alabama in particular to commercial shipping. But there's a sort of a section on that in the book too, because it is reasonably well known that Britain built those warships for the Confederacy. What is less well known is that the Union government also tried to get warships built in Britain as well. And the same firm, Laird Brothers in Birkenhead, agreed to build them. Britain was a very mercenary country. It still is, but it certainly was then. And okay, it had 2 sides in the war, and they both wanted to buy warships. Yeah, we'll build them.
It was not in spite of official neutrality.
Well, this is complicated. Official neutrality. Yes, Britain was officially neutral. And the Queen's Proclamation, which was issued almost immediately the war started in May 1861, gave a long list of things that British citizens couldn't do. But the Queen's Proclamation was not law. It was a proclamation. It wasn't a law. The law which the government relied upon to enforce it was something called the Foreign Enlistment Act, which had been passed in 1819 for some completely different purpose, and don't ask me now what it was, but it's some totally different purpose. And it had never been tested in a court of law until the American Civil War. And it was, so the government tried to stop the Alabama leaving port, but they were outwitted by Confederate agents in Liverpool. That one went away. And then they tried to use the Foreign Enlistment Act to prevent other ships being built. And the courts held that it wasn't illegal. As long as, there's so much in this, but as long as the armaments were not obvious, and as long as the destination was said to be somewhere else, then it was perfectly legal. So, and this happened, I think it may have happened with the Alabama, certainly happened with one of them. No, we're not saying this to America, we're saying this to Egypt. And you take them out of British waters, fix all the gun turrets on once it's outside British territorial waters, there you are, you haven't debated the law. But that's what went on. And the difficulty was, there were sort of shades of today's politics in a way, and shades of sort of Brexit type issues that were both the Liberal government and the Conservative opposition was strongly in favour of neutrality and trying to be impartial. But there were a lot of backbenchers on both parties who wanted to support the Confederacy. And nobody knew quite where the majority lay, because what should have happened was that a new act should have been produced to replace the Foreign Enlistment Act for the set of circumstances that was obtaining in this war. But the government didn't dare to bring in such an act because it wasn't sure it could get the majority in the House of Commons to pass it. So it thought it was safer to rely on the 1819 Act, despite the fact that it proved to be useless.
Actually, we had quite a number of people online, 12 people online. I'll just read out for Perfidious Britain, the one, Jeff Morgan, who's a fellow with us, say, just a comment, I think, other contemporary examples exist of British people ignoring the exploitation of slave workers overseas, doing a huge dependence on the dangerous mining careers from Africa and Asia, essential to the manufacture of mobile phones, computers, and increasingly batteries for the electric car revolution. So I think he's trying to tell us that we shouldn't feel too superior about it.
No, indeed. No. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really sort of fascinated by this talk. I think it's been a tour de force about to present very complex problems in a sort of very lucid way. And just to add something in about the complex British reaction to the Civil War. I think you're absolutely right when you talk about the diversity of the British economy, muffled what might have been the disastrous effects of the Lancashire Cotton Famine. Outside of Lancashire, I well remember reading once a kind of crocodile tears missive from Cardiff Chamber of Commerce to the American consul in Cardiff, commiserating about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And the list is a number of all the names of coal exporters. And those very same coal exporters in 1861, 1862 had suddenly acquired a massive interest in exporting coal to the Bahamas and to Havana for markets that had never previously interested them, because of course they were precisely the kind of transit points for sending coal into the Confederacy. But the question I have, there is a question. I wonder if you could say something a bit more formal about the new historians of capitalism, who really have sort of exploded the idea that there was an inherent conflict between a modern industrial north and a backward agricultural south, by emphasising the fact that the south was sleek and modern, as they see it. But of course, in doing so, they've rather undercut that traditional explanation of why the American Civil War broke out, why secession led to civil war, because their essential kind of position is there is no incompatibility between the industrial north and the agricultural south. I wonder how your analysis of the cotton trade plays with that.
I can talk a bit about it, but it's veering to outside my focus for this. I mean, this is all, but it all feeds into what I was saying about not Civil War not having ended, and about some Americans wanting to justify the Confederacy, and some got the historians amongst them, almost all of them from southern states. And you know what happened. You know that after we had this complete disaster of Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, followed by a remarkable presidency, I think, of Ulysses S. Grant, who really did try and make sure that what should have been the fruits of the Civil War were delivered. And then as soon as his second term was over, everything fell to pieces, and you just got a complete reversion to well, the attitudes have never gone away, but you've got the reversion to the behaviour. And you know, the start of the Jim Crow era and all sorts of things. But then there grew up this sort of body of histories, new history of the South, that attempted, as far as I'm concerned, to rewrite history. You know, I mean, you can't conceivably say that the South was anything like on a par to the North, you know, at the time of the Civil War, industrially. I mean, there were poles of it. There was only one armory factory in the southern states when the war started, I think in North Carolina. It's only one. I mean, it was nothing, just tracts after tracts of land, most of it used for growing cotton. They were completely different economies, and the South's economy was totally dependent on cotton, and they thought that they could use that basically to blackmail Europe. Unfortunately, they failed.
think maybe we're getting over the legacy of Eugene Genovese.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, how contingent is this? If the South hadn't made the mistake of attacking Fort Sumter, could the secession process not have eventuated in war, and therefore slavery would not have ended in 1860, in 1865? It could have cheerfully gone on into the late 19th century, into the 20th.
Well, this is, one of the what-ifs of history, of which there are many millions. I mean, all we can say for certain is that, had the war not taken place, there would not still be slavery in the southern states of America now. But at what point in the last 150 years it would have ended of its own accord, as it were, it is impossible to say. But there were quite a lot of people in Britain at the time, and including, I discount those who were sympathetic to the Confederacy, because they were looking for any argument they could get hold of. But people like John Stuart Mill and Richard Cobden both believed that the South would have to emancipate its own slaves before very long. They both believed that there would be a complete economic compulsion to do so if the Confederacy was trying to go it alone as an independent state. So, slavery might have ended sooner than might otherwise have thought without the Civil War. I mean, it's a very, very good point, and it will never be resolved.
Well, Abraham Lincoln thought in 1858 that might end in 1950. Other questions?
So, Jim, I was wondering you could say a little bit about the Liverpool context. Are there dissenting voices in terms of, particularly within the merchant elites?
Yes.
Traders that you're talking about. I'm intrigued as to, is there anyone saying that this is not?
Liverpool has, I think, got a somewhat unfair reputation, and I haven't talked about that today, but there's a lot about it in the book. Because the perception of Liverpool is that it was basically an overwhelmingly pro-Confederate town. That's what it was seen. I don't believe that was true. I mean, it certainly wasn't, you can't argue the opposite case either. But I don't think you can say it was overwhelmingly Confederate. It's certainly true that all the operations were based in Liverpool. Not only the Confederate operations in Europe, but also the Union to a large extent as well, because Liverpool was the first point of contact between Britain and America, both halves of it. So it was a real hotspot during the war, but there was a great diversity of opinion, and amongst Liverpool merchants, there was their prime concern was that the war should end as soon as possible, and they strongly supported British neutrality, strongly supported non-intervention in any form whatever, and just wanted it to end soon. Cotton brokers were a bit different, because cotton brokers were massively enriched by the Civil War. I mean, that graph that we looked at earlier, I believe, I can't prove that, nobody can prove it, but I believe that probably in terms of the cotton actually traded on the Liverpool market, that reached a higher sterling value in 1864 than ever since. It was enormous. So, I mean, a lot of the Liverpool brokers, even if, again, as we were talking about earlier, even if they were abolitionists, they've done extremely well out of the war and were not averse to it continuing. But Liverpool's, in general, the attitudes there were subtle. We're talking about coal being shipped from South Wales to the Confederacy. Well, a great deal of coal was shipped from Liverpool to the north. And indeed, one of the major Liverpool ship owners shipped it free of charge to the north. There was quite a lot. It's fair to say that the merchants and ship owners who supported the north tended to keep quiet. And the ones who made the noise were the pro-Confederates. But there was much more of a balance in Liverpool than is generally thought, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for a fascinating talk about cotton, which was important in Hull in the 1860s
Indeed.
as well as sometimes people who see Hull as entirely abolitionist town to mention, but important all over the country, and particularly interesting to hear about the connection between the American Civil War and Liverpool and cotton in this period. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to people online and the people in the audience for attending.
Yes, thank you, wherever you are, thank you.
And I'd like to for a drink